Good afternoon. It's Bill Martin here at the Valentine, and we're happy that you joined us today for our Lunch and Learn. Problem is, COVID, there's no lunch. But hope that you'll enjoy your time today as we talk about some of the important work that the Valentine is doing and how it relates to this much bigger picture and much bigger conversation about the role of museums, and particularly history museums, in Richmond and across the country. And so really I'm going to start with a little overview of what we call the Valentine Moment Campaign. And this campaign really is absolutely a fundraising campaign, but it's more than a campaign. It's a way to rethink the role of the Valentine as we move forward. Certainly it has been an interesting time in Richmond and for our history and for museums that are serving that history and trying to help us work through what all of this means. And so for the Valentine, it means a number of things. This campaign will support what I call our new collection. As you know, we've said for years that there's 1.6 million objects in this collection. The question is what tells the Richmond story in the best way? Does everything relate to Richmond? Are there things from across the country that belong in other museums that we might want to consider? And so over the last 2 years, and we'll have a few more, we're looking at every object in this collection. If there really are 1.6 million, we're going to find that there are 1.6 million. And not only decide whether it belongs here, but make sure that it goes to the place that it needs to be and wants to be, and to tell those stories. By opening up this collection, by eliminating some things, we're actually opening up the collection to new stories, to make sure that all of Richmond's stories can be found within our collection. And so we can do things like add the entire Style magazine archives photography to our collection. Prior to this process, there wouldn't have been space, and yet this is an important story. And so that new storage, new access, you'll actually be able to come in for a reading room that now we don't have. So we'll be providing both online and in real world access to this collection. But it's also supporting a new conversation across the community about what does this mean? What does our history mean? And certainly we'll be deeply involved with the Black History Museum in a discussion about monuments. And that's not our conversation for today. That's an entirely different conversation and a big one. But we do have a spot on our campus that's important to telling that conversation, and that is our studio project. Edward Valentine was a sculptor and created many of the images that we know, from Jefferson Davis on Monument Avenue to statues across the South. Those are created right in the Garden of the Valentine. And what do we do with that building? What do we do with that opportunity to tell that story? Because we know that Jefferson Davis walked through that door into Edward Valentine's studio to be measured. What do we do with that story, and how can we use that in ways that are useful to the future in our conversations? It's about our community conversations that will continue throughout the years, thinking about this studio and inviting people to tell us what we should do about how we should approach the studio project. You'll also know that we are doing a project with the Mellon Foundation, with an amazing group here in town, creating projections across the city, 6 locations, 3 days, that we will use at the Valentine as a way of soliciting and eliciting community input on where the Valentine should go on its exhibitions and how we should approach this difficult history that we know we have to tell. It's also this project, the memory project, the Valentine Moment project, is really also about our commitment to the city. It's important for our facilities on Clay Street to be the kinds of facilities that represent our city and our region the way it should. And there are certainly things that need to be done, particularly in our collection storage, but in our public access. We're committed, we're doubling down our commitment to public education. This is a time when kids need us and schools need us to talk about the difficult stories of our cities and the Commonwealth's history, and in ways that encourage dialogue and meaningful conversation and meaningful understanding. And so, how are we useful? How is the Valentine useful? And I don't think there's anyone that has not been more inspiring to me and important to me than our speaker today, Dr. Ed Ayers. Ed is on the board here at the Valentine, but many know he's a faculty member at University of Richmond, former president, I guess president emeritus is the official title. We need to remember that he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama. These are, an amazing list of accomplishments. His book On the Edge of the South actually changed the way I thought about my own life and about the role of the Valentine. So there are these important writings and his important presence in the public history community that has really transformed us. And so today is, we often talk about the Valentine. Today is really to put what is the role of a public institution like the Valentine? How important, how central is that institution to how we discuss history more broadly? And so it is a really great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Ed Ayers.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's great to be with you today, and I look forward to our conversation with everyone. So people will be thinking of good questions while I'm talking. As it turns out, I've known the Valentine longer than I've known anything else in Richmond, because I started working with the museum back in the 80s. That's the 1980s, when I was just beginning at UVA. Greg Kimball and I taught courses on Richmond history for Richmond teachers, and I learned a lot in the process. And in each decade since, I've had the opportunity to collaborate with Valentine, sending students here, working on joint projects, and admiring the remarkable leadership and staff of this place. The more you know about Bill Martin and the Valentine, the more you admire this gift to our city. So as Bill suggested, I want to begin by pulling the camera back a bit to look at the larger landscape of history teaching and preservation in which the Valentine works. And it turns out a few years ago, I had the opportunity to address the National Governors Association at their annual meeting in Santa Fe. So I thought it might be helpful, a kind of accountability, if I told you what I told them then, both because things have not changed and because they have. I want to present us with a puzzle. Everyone, regardless of party, agrees that our nation's history is the foundation of all that we are. Everyone appeals to history, salutes our history, is proud of our history, and wants our children to know our history. Americans seek out history in best-selling books and television shows and movies and musicals and tourism and genealogy and explorations of their very DNA. And yet, American history has been diminished in our schools over the last 2 decades. History is disappearing from the elementary curriculum in schools across the United States, folded into language arts classes, mined for canned text, but ignored for its rich and human historic meaning. Children are not learning to think historically as part of their fundamental education, as a part of the way they see the world. The range of the history we teach in space and in time is narrowing. And this is a profound loss to our students, our schools, our communities, our states, and our nation. Because history teaches fundamental facts taught nowhere else. And I don't mean lists of presidents. I mean facts such as this. The world has not always been this way, and it will not stay the way it is now. That people of all kinds move history in ways terrifying and inspiring. That true knowledge of history is based on evidence, not political convenience, wishful thinking, or national vanity. There are no more important facts than these that we could be teaching our children. No knowledge more important for all people to share. Now, given this undeniable value of history, then, how did we lose it in our schools? How did we diminish something everyone claims to value? We didn't do it on purpose. We lost history when we were looking in other directions, when we focused our energies and resources on subjects we considered more essential. In part because it's all around us, we took history for granted, forgetting how hard it is to teach well, how essential it is to understand the nation and the world, how they got to where they are. Now, fortunately, if history teaches us one lesson, it is that change is constant. So despite the erosion of history's place over the last 20 years, we are surrounded by talent and ideas and goodwill and momentum in the remarkable history education community. Devoted historians, teachers, and curators have never stopped working to keep history alive, no matter what the political currents are, to make it more vital and innovative. We're ready to teach history much better than we did in the past, when we relied on dull textbooks, rote memorization of an uninspiring lists, vacuous vocabulary words, and putatively important events whose significance students didn't really understand, even if they knew more or less when they happened. The time has come to put the same energy and commitment into history education that we put into science and math education. We need to approach our understanding of our social lives with the same urgency that we've devoted to understanding the physical world. And in fact, good history education is not very different from good science education. The key to both is discovery, experimentation, confronting evidence without the lesson already scripted beforehand. Students can now see history firsthand, finding remarkable true stories in thousands of digitized newspapers from their own states, in complex patterns on maps traced across generations, in military records, oral histories, television footage from the 1950s. History is becoming discovery. And just as science has been repeatedly revolutionized by new tools and methods of observation, now history is finding new ways to see the complicated patterns of the past and the individuals who made those patterns. For the first time, history has access to the equivalent of telescopes and microscopes to view the past at new scales, ways to see the entire nation and individuals within it with new clarity. We can reach millions of students at vanishingly low cost. And speaking of cost, let's talk about revenue in American history. Over half of the nation's 35,000 museums and sites are devoted to history. Museums, among the most trusted institutions of the country, each year generate more than $50 billion for the nation's GDP, making history tourism one of the most important drivers of every state's economy. Now, this is especially true in Virginia, of course. Unfortunately, I commented before we could imagine COVID, our history museums are not seeing as many students as they should because schools don't have funds or time among the priorities established for them by high-stakes testing for field trips. In those museums, young minds are touched with imagination and excitement. Having taught freshmen for a long time at UR, I asked them, so why are you in this history class? You've got the whole world of knowledge. And they gave me two answers over and over again. One, they had a great teacher, or two, they visited a place, often a museum, that they always remembered. Those are the opportunities that we can't waste. Every student deserves the opportunity to visit their museums. And I know the Valentine, one of its great traditions, is it has been open far longer than most public museums to the entire range of the students in Richmond, and has spoken to them in meaningful language. An investment in sending students to historical museums would pay both immediate and long-term benefits, strengthening the civic core and an educational system at the same time. Another investment would be good business and good leadership. You can hear me talking to the governors here. I'm saying things that I thought would get their attention. Paying teachers what they earn and what they deserve should be one of your highest priorities. We seem to have forgotten in the era of standards and testing that teachers are the keys to teaching. We need to recruit excellent young people into the teaching ranks through encouragement and incentive. And once they're in the classrooms, we need to free, enable, and encourage those teachers to connect with their students so their students can connect with each other and with their world. Teachers of history, like all teachers, need to be recognized and rewarded, offered opportunities to advance their learning and to collaborate with one another, something else that the Valentine is great at. Beyond that, I hope you will look for ways to include your teachers, historians, and curators on your commissions and advisory bodies. Invite them to help you frame your approach to governance with historical perspective. Visit the classes taught by the inspiring teachers in your states at all levels of education. Talk with business and civic leaders about the importance of an education that helps make better people, not just better workers. Visit the history museums in your states and celebrate them. Foster collaboration among teachers of all kinds of institutions at every level. Fortunately, there's something the National Governors Association can do collectively right now to advance these larger purposes. You can resolve to make our nation ready for its 250th anniversary in 2026. You can encourage the impressive sponsors among you to support innovative and inclusive approaches to sharing the history of our nation with its own children, a history in which everyone can see themselves and a future for themselves. Together, in a bipartisan spirit, you could help the nation use its anniversary to build unity, a unity born of honesty and inclusion. We can regain what we unintentionally gave away, a vital engagement with our own past, rooted in schools and museums, tapping exciting possibilities that did not exist just a few years ago. There are historians in every state in organized and effective groups already thinking about this anniversary, eager to work with you. Our history is the very definition of who we are and who we believe we can become. We teach history to our children and to ourselves every day by omission or intention. We can either teach that history is based on respect for evidence and expertise, or we can make up a history that supports what we think of at the moment. I personally vote for schools and museums as the places to which we entrust our history. I vote for innovation and openness. I vote for teachers and curators. And I vote for a renewed dedication to our past is the only true way to our future. So that's what I told them. And as you've seen, it completely transformed the nation. Every governor got immediately behind the vision of history education that I laid out there. No, they didn't. And in many ways, that seems like a simpler time, way back in 2018, just 2.5 years ago. And today, of course, the stakes are even higher. We've seen the importance of history, even if we didn't want to. Now, here in Richmond, we've been on quite the journey over the last decade. And as it turns out, I found myself carried along in that journey. Way back in the 1970s, I chose to study the South and its attendant issues of race, inequality, justice, and politics and violence because those subjects seemed important then. And they still seem important now. I'm a native Southerner. I thought it was important to try to understand the place where I'm from and where I've chosen to stay and raise our children. But you understand it not by avoiding hard questions, but by leaning into them. Now, I wrote a book 30 years ago this year about the South after Reconstruction, the era when the statues went up and the Lost Cause was born and Edward Valentine was out in the backyard there carving statues. So I started noticing flags and statues when other people didn't see much meaning in them. When, as I described them later, they look like old Victorian furniture somehow left in the middle of our cities. I then wrote 2 books about the Civil War before coming to UR in 2007. Now, it turned out there was a lot I didn't know about Richmond, living a whole hour away for all those years. When I got here, I discovered a deep and complex city, bustling with millennial energy, and yet shadowed by slavery, war, and the lost cause. We all know what people feel they have to say after they say Richmond, : I'm not going to say it. So the sesquicentennial of the Civil War arrived early in my presidential term, and I was able to offer the beautiful facilities of UR for the first event in the nation for the commemoration in 2009. Building on that success, about 25 historical organizations in Richmond, including, generously enough, Bill Martin and the Valentine, even though its mission did not and does not focus on the Civil War, still came together to form what we call the future of Richmond's past. We reframed the sesquicentennial of the Civil War to embrace emancipation. For 5 years, the coalition sponsored conversations, debates, and events across the city, and our work culminated on April 3rd, 2015, when we celebrated the liberation of Richmond by the Federal Army, including reenactors of the United States colored troops marching up the same main street they'd marched up in 1865. The state, it still seems kind of remarkable in retrospect, gave us permission to use the beautiful grounds of the Capitol, where pop-up museums interpreted life in the city in the years of war and freedom, and where the governor, the mayor, and local leaders of the Black community spoke from the steps of the same gleaming white Capitol that had been occupied by the Confederate government. American flags waved everywhere. I saw no Confederate flags. A powerful ceremony in Shockoe Bottom remembered the people buried there who'd never had a chance to see emancipation. Richmond won a nice article in the Smithsonian Magazine saying that we'd done the best job in the United States in commemorating the Civil War and emancipation. And we did. It seemed that perhaps we crossed some kind of barrier of understanding and honesty. 2 months later, the brutal killing of Black churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina by a young man posing with a Confederate battle flag ignited efforts to displace that flag from positions of public display, including South Carolina. And efforts to remove Confederate monuments followed as well, gaining momentum. Now, you know the story after that for Richmond. You know about the Monument Avenue Commission. You know about how Charlottesville went from being a pretty college town to being an event. You know about the Monument Avenue Commission again after we were instructed that we could say that a monument should be removed. You know about George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protest, and you know about the removal of the statues. And through all of that, it seems, we went through 4 stages of dealing with the legacies of the lost cause. First was invisibility, when we had to persuade people that this part of our past mattered. I can remember out talking about this during the sesquicentennial, and I'd see quite a few rolling eyes on people across the political spectrum when we told them we needed to think about the Civil War and its monuments, that they were still sort of live ammunition in the city. People said, well, let's forget about this history stuff and talk about the dining scene or whatever. And I felt like such a Scrooge by saying, well, it'd be nice if we could do that, but we can't forget it. They are still with us. So that first period of sort of invisibility, because people had gotten used to the monuments. Second was a period of concern, when people began to recognize that the flags and the monuments held meaning, whether we wanted them to or not. People putting words in other people's mouths about what they felt and thought about these monuments. I can remember being out at a predominantly white church in Richmond talking about this, and at the end of it, an elderly Black woman came up and squeezed my hand, and she said, you know, Dr. Ayers, when we were children, our families took us to see those monuments, and they said, these are for us to tell us to be quiet and to stay in our place. When I repeated that story to other white congregations and groups, they were shocked. It never occurred to them that those statues had had those meanings for generations now. So we have invisibility, we have concern, then we have the period of crisis. When Charlottesville demonstrated what was at stake in our democracy, when symbols of the Nazis marched alongside symbols of the Confederacy surrounding statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. It's interesting that Richmond, which has carried such a burden for so long of this history, was transformed by events happening in Charlottesville, which had paid almost no attention to the role of the Civil War in its own history, kind of skipping immediately from Thomas Jefferson to the latest ball game, but despite these huge statues. And suddenly it turns out that those statues had meaning in Charlottesville as well. And we know that after that happened, Mayor Stoney instructed the commission to consider actually removing statues rather than explaining them. Invisibility, concern, crisis. And the 4th stage is exhaustion. When the statues are gone, but no one really knows the next step. I'm not sure there's much appetite right now for talking about the monuments anymore. And that's why I think that the steps of the Black History Museum and the Valentine of helping in this transition are so important. And even in this period of exhaustion, because of leadership of of those museums and others, right now, right here, people are already helping to plan the next stage, which is necessary stage, reckoning and renewal. This is not the end of that history. This is a pause in that history. We're still in charge of what's going to happen next. Valentine will help us lead in that final stage. We have a remarkable array of museums in Richmond, led by brave and expert people who are stepping up. Black History Museum, the American Civil War Museum, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, the Library of Virginia, the VMFA, and other organizations and bodies are collaborating to help us steer us through the next 5 years, in some ways to redeem the years that have come before, to transform what had been symbols of division into symbols of unity and renewed commitment to justice. As I do, I think we might consider some lessons that we've learned along the way. For me, at least, 5 lessons come to mind. First is humility. We need to be humble as we confront the great wrongs of the past and as we confront all those who have a stake in their remembrance. No one has all the answers. We are not morally superior to the people of the past, even those who committed great wrongs, just because we're alive now. We should use those wrongs and the decisions they made as mirrors to ourselves, to try to see ourselves with new clarity. Second, knowledge. We need to know exactly what we're talking about, and that can only come through hard research. Passionate opinion must be earned. If we really care about the people of the past, we have to understand them. And our museums are the places to look for that knowledge. People trust them more than any other form of history, as they should. The kind of public accountability, literally putting on display what you have and what you say about it, every day talking with a remarkably diverse audience of whoever might walk into the door. Museums are critical to gaining that knowledge and conveying it. Third, honesty. We cannot wish the past away. We must confront it head on, unflinching. We have to follow the evidence wherever it takes us, even if it implicates our institutions. We've seen what happens when we try to ignore the past, to drive by it, to clean it up. The past only appears to sleep. In fact, it's always working. It's shaping us, especially when we're unaware of it, when we don't think of it as the past or history. It's the very oxygen of our lives. Humility, knowledge, honesty. Fourth is patience. Dealing with the wrongs of centuries cannot be settled easily or quickly. It will take enormous effort, years to work through it. It will never be finished. That shouldn't be the goal, is to try to mark this off our to-do list. There's an unavoidable tension between doing things right and making progress that people can see so they can understand that things are being done. We have to live with that tension. And fifth, determination. History has handed us the opportunity and the obligation to do this work. People will disagree, often aggressively, often cynically, and perhaps even indulge in personal attacks about the sincerity or purpose of the people doing this work. People will use history for partisan purposes, misrepresenting those who teach and interpret the past. So to help people understand some of these complexities and others in U.S. history, my colleagues and I at a project called New American History based at UR are building some free tools. This is, we think of in some ways as a kind of a virtual museum. I'd like to show you one quickly that might be helpful as we move forward in all of these. One of our major tools is called Bunk. It's named after the Henry Ford quote that history is more or less bunk. The only history that matters at Tinker's Dam, he said, is the history we make today. And so what Bunk is a real-time curation of representations of the American past in all media every day. There are now 10,000 articles in this, and they're all tagged by hand by students at UR, overseen by professionals to make sure they're right. And I never know exactly what it's going to look like whenever I call it up. Matter of fact, it's changed since we looked at it 20 minutes ago. But let me show how it works, because my hope is that you will use this and you won't come out for an hour. Let's choose King was a critical race theorist before there was a name for it. See, it calls that up, and that's an article from the Los Angeles Times. And you can read the first 200 words, then it takes you to it. But if you click over on View Connections, what you'll see is all kinds of other articles that relate to this is Dr. King and his legacy. What did it mean? There in the middle, you can see critical race theory, historical memory, all these different topics that are all linked. Let's choose historical memory if we could. Click on that and you see we have 547 articles about historical memory, about the very business of museums. And they are selected from across the entire political range, every kind of topic, and there's going to be things that we guarantee you could be interested in. But 547 is probably more than you want to read at lunchtime. So let's narrow the list a little bit and do a search if we could. And let's go ahead and search for Confederate, even though I said I wasn't going to talk about that, just to see because that is what we're thinking about. So as you can see, here are all the different categories. And since Confederate monuments are something that we're involved with, you click on that. And then you can see this, and you can see then that it will spin out into other kinds of topics as well. Okay. So our hope is that this is for teachers walking into a class and some student is sprawled in the back seat who thinks, why do I have to care about all this dead people? What's the point? This is a way of showing those students that history is being sold to you every day. It's being presented to you in your video games, including, think about what Microsoft just bought for tens of billions of dollars. It's a game set in the past, right? And that history is not just the stuff in that textbook, but it's living in your community. It's visible all around you. It's living in those museums. And it would be better if you actually thought about the different uses to which history is being put and make up your own mind. There's lots of other cool aspects of this that I can show you. Annie Evans, our Director of Education and Outreach, is working with teachers across the country all the time to help them think about how do we talk about the hard things that we're being presented with right now. So the message here is that no one perspective can reveal all that history holds, that we all need each other, and the particular insights that no one of us possesses. And a museum devoted to telling the full story of our city is essential to that work. So those are the things I wanted to say, the sermon I wanted to deliver today. I see here that there are some questions, and so I will look at the first one. I'm just going to read them in order, and we'll see where it goes. The question is, who is entitled to lead dialogue about an authentic history? That's a really good question that has a complicated answer, I think. First of all, I think we all have to respect descendant communities who have a special responsibility and opportunity and ability to talk about the histories of their own families and communities. But we can't only put that responsibility on them. We have the responsibility for all of us to realize that we share a history. You think about Shockoe Bottom right now, right? Well, it's being led by people who are the descendants of enslaved people. Seems entirely appropriate. But that was a history also of people who ran the slave jails and who profited from it and who built entire family dynasties off that money, and of the city itself that was in many ways that surrounded Shockoe Bottom. So I think authority comes from knowledge and passionate commitment, and that we have to broaden the circle of people who feel not only equipped but obligated to say what they have to say about this as well. So these are tricky issues that at the same time that we don't want to have ventriloquism, we don't want to be speaking for other people, but on the other hand, recognizing that history is a shared responsibility. Something I've said is that people like to imagine their heritage. It's just the good things that they've inherited from the past. But we inherit the debt as well. We inherit the obligation. And so I think that as we think about this authentic history, has many aspects, many elements to it. I think entering into it with mutual respect, even tolerance for people to do the best they can to make sense of it is the way for us to make that history as meaningful and as constructive for the future as possible. So rather than thinking of history as a possession, we need to think of it as a shared obligation. So that's my thought about that. So I'll just move on to the next question. Is it reasonable that I am bothered by the flying of the flag of the Confederate States of America, not the battle flag with which most are familiar? A resident of my community has one on his lamppost in his front yard. Well, is it reasonable? I'm bothered by things much less meaningful than that I see on license plates and bumper stickers. So I think it's reasonable to be bothered by whatever you're bothered about. It is a fact, of course, that people have right of free expression. And I think that what we've seen in recent years is not over the debate over whether people have a right to show those things on their own vehicles or yards. They do. But what right does public space, shared space, have to proclaim one vision of the past, especially one that has been discredited by waging war against the United States? So I think it's reasonable, and that person wants you to feel that way is one thing to recognize. And so one thing to think about is whether it's something I tell myself, that was posted there on this bumper to annoy me. I'm just going to laugh at it and think about, really, that's your identity? That's what you care about enough to plaster, to show the world? I bet there are other things that are more important than that you could be thinking about. So I try to quote Elvis Costello, I used to be disgusted, now I try to be amused, because, those things cannot be made to go away. But that does not mean that we don't need to be vigilant about shared public spaces. So, okay, there we go. How best can museums inform the community with these difficult conversations when the institutions themselves have historically engaged directly or perpetuated the very issues that are being reckoned with? Again, I would say it's because they have been historically engaged in, I would even say implicated in, patterns of injustice, of erasure, of denial, of lying, of glossing over profound facts of human injustice. If we exclude anybody who is complicit in that acts of the past, there's going to be a very small number of people who can talk today. Universities are wrestling with this in the same way. What obligation do we have to the founders of our institutions when they were engaged in slavery, segregation, most particularly? And so we had a wonderful conversation that I hosted with representatives from Washington Lee and William and Mary and UVA and Furman, which you are, to think about this. We're wrestling with this ourselves. And so if we don't begin with the assumption that if you live in the South, here in Virginia, where slavery existed far longer than we have lived without slavery, the chances are there is injustice under every square foot. The chances are that there is a false history that has been taught. I'd say that museums can claim credibility in this only by what they do now, not by what they've done in the past. And I think all of us know the wonderful acts of reinvention that are going on around Richmond in our historical sites and museums. And we've seen certainly the Valentine, sort of a very disciplined focus on what is our responsibility, what is the story that we have special responsibility to tell. So I think you want to begin by acknowledging that, say, Edward Valentine's studio was in the back of the Valentine. And what does that mean? I think it's actually can be just as powerful for an institution that has been engaged in these injustices in the past to step up and acknowledge. And everything I've seen about the Valentine shows that that's what's happening here. And I think the counterparts are elsewhere. So we need to look for ways to empower people to engage with the past, not exclude them. I guess is my general position on this. How can museums inform the community with difficult conversations? Well, you know, Valentine does this. Already they've seen that conversations about things that people might not think of as historic can bring out large numbers of people who can then understand, oh, I see this historical element to it. And that's important, that how we got here is going to matter a lot about telling us where we're going to go. So I think the Valentine embodies a lot of the lessons that I had, that I laid out, with humility and knowledge and patience, willingness to recognize if you stage a conversation, you may yourself come under criticism. That's one thing about this, is that it requires, I don't like the phrase thick skin, because it's not to suggest you're repelling criticism. It means that you're listening to criticism, weighing what seems fair in it, what might seem to you misguided, what you had not considered that you should consider in the future. But anybody who's going to engage in these conversations is going to risk having their feelings hurt and having their purposes misrepresented. And I think that if we don't do that, if everything is staged so that it is decorous, it can't really do the hard, dirty work that history needs to do. So I think the Valentine, as far as I know, is the example in Richmond of having conversations, of using the gravitas of the museum, the trust that it's acquired over decades of good, honest work, to know that people can come here and say what they think, and they'll be treated with respect. So I think how can museums do it? They can follow the example of the Valentine. Okay, so I believe I might have the questions that I see in the chat, but if anybody else would, I see nobody's really held back from asking hard questions. If anybody had any easy questions, that would be fine as well. But that is the kind of what we had to talk about today, is that Richmond is in many ways at the center of what the country has been reckoning with over the last 5 years. I'm actually proud of the way that the city has stepped up to embrace this, by which I mean especially historical organizations. I think the country's looking to us now to see, where do we go from here? Okay, you folks had that inheritance of 150 years. You've reckoned with that. Now where do we go? Now what matters? Now what stories do we tell? Now what conversations do we have? Now what monuments, if any, do we put up? It's an exciting time to be in this conversation, and it's an honor to be associated with the Valentine and our great colleagues and allies there. Thanks very much for joining us today. Bill?
Ed, thank you so much for challenging us today and beginning to help us with this conversation about what's next for this community and what's next for the Valentine. And you know what? This is a Valentine moment. It is a time for this institution to reassert its role in this history that we helped create. And this is our time to think about how we can do it more effectively. And so that's why we have the Valentine Moment Campaign, to make sure that we are ready, that we're prepared with access to those collections that provide the underpinning for everything that we're going to build, but also to create the infrastructure for our education programs, for the community, for our technology challenges. All of those things need to be ready for this challenge of the Valentine moment when the city has this unique opportunity. And so, Ed, thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks everyone for being here. One quick aside, you know, those community conversations that we do today actually began with the Future of Richmond's Past initiative all those years ago. And the conversation can't stop. So thank you for joining us today.